are your self-control idols? We all have these people in our lives. People who motivate us, who inspire us, who encourage us to be better versions of ourselves. And we find them in all different walks of life. One area of our lives that we may look for inspiration comes to physical activity. And one self-control idol that lots of people have is Michael Phelps. He's an incredible athlete, having earned more Olympic medals than anyone in the history of the Games. But his self-control seems to be what's most impressive about him. In fact, in a recent interview, he said he couldn't remember the last day he didn't do a workout. Now, how many people can really say that? Another example of rock-solid self-control comes from ultramarathon man Dean Karnazes. Now, Dean Karnazes recently ran 50 marathons in 50 states in 50 days. Now, if you think that sounds incredible, think again. Dean also ran 350 miles consecutively without stopping. It took him 80 hours to do that, and toward the end of it, he said that he was sleeping while he was running. Now, Dean's most recent goal is to run a marathon in every single country in the world in a single year. That's over 200 marathons in a single year. That's pretty incredible. But outside of athletics, we can also gain insight and motivation and inspiration from people such as writers. As someone who loves to write, one of my self-control idols is Dame Barbara Cartland. Now, by all measures, she's one of the most prolific writers of all time. In fact, in a single year, she wrote 23 books. Stephen King is another example of tremendous self-control. Not only has he sold millions of copies of books, but he's written 2,000 words a day, every day, for decades. Haruki Murakami is another great example of a writer who has tremendous self-control. He goes to sleep every night at 9 p.m. and wakes up at 4 a.m. He begins his writing, and when he's done with it, he goes running. In fact, Murakami is not only a prolific writer, he's also an endurance athlete. But athletics and writing, those are just two areas of our lives where people exert self-control. Think of Oprah Winfrey. She overcame tremendous adversity in her life and went on to become not only one of the wealthiest people in the world, but one of the most influential women in the history of our planet. She's influenced numerous individuals in both the 20th and the 21st centuries. Nelson Mandela is another example of tremendous self-control, of persisting in the face of failure, of sticking to his beliefs even when it was difficult, and his self-control efforts paid off tremendously, ending apartheid in South Africa. Mother Teresa, Martin Luther King Jr., all of these people, if you line them up, they might look very different. They might have different skill sets, different experiences, maybe even different motivations. But one thing that they share in common is an inner strength, a strength that enables them to override any impulse to give up. Now, this inner strength is called self-control, and it's one of the most powerful inner strengths that we have. And fortunately, it's one of the most easiest to improve. So when you think of your self-control idols, what I want you to do is not only look at the fruits of their labor, but also think about what got them there. And what I would argue is that one facet that helped them achieve all of the success that they achieved in their lives is their ability to exert self-control successfully. When we're trying to understand self-control, what it is and why some people are so good at it, a lot of times we have to begin by understanding people who have extremely poor self-control. Now, this is similar to what other scientists do when they're trying to understand pathology. Physicians, when they're trying to understand how to treat someone, how to make them healthy, a lot of times they'll begin by trying to understand the person's disease or ailments that the people have. And by understanding those ailments or deficiencies, we can understand how to get these people better. Now, self-control is similar. And over the past several decades, researchers have begun to explore extreme cases, both within the scientific community and from real-world life, of when people, even high-achieving people, fail to control their impulses. Now, one of these examples comes from Spain. Now, during the Spanish Civil War, a man who is aged 21 was escaping from his apartment. And as he was making a mad dash out of his window, he fell. He slid down, and he was impaled on an iron bar. Now, he survived the fall amazingly, but the bar went through his brain. But it wasn't any old part of his brain, it was his frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe is an area of the brain that's responsible for self-control. So although this patient survived and went on to marry and have children, he also had lots of problems. He had difficulty managing his money. He lacked drive and purpose. He had difficulty planning things. He couldn't see long into the future. In fact, as he got older and older, his kids called him a protected person. So although other aspects of his life remained the same, when it came to controlling his impulses, there is a clear link between this damage to the frontal lobe of his brain and his ability to control his impulses later in life. Now, another famous example comes from Phineas Gage, who was working on the railroad, experienced an accident where a rod, again, went right through his brain. He survived the accident, but his life was never the same. He wasn't the same worker. He wasn't even the same relationship partner. But these are extreme examples, and they give us an understanding about how severe brain damage can undermine self-control, but there are a lot less extreme examples that can also help us see how people can fail to control their impulses. Oftentimes we look at political leaders who are often high-achieving people, but who also occasionally succumb to their impulses. Former President Bill Clinton is an example of this. Now, by all measures, he's an incredibly brilliant person, a Rhodes Scholar. But over the course of his life, he's also had some very public failings in his self-control. Now, more recently, General David Petraeus has also shown that he's human, that he has problems, and those problems can relate to his ability to control his impulses. Now, even this man, who lived his life as a model of self-discipline, showed that he too is prone to self-control failures in at least some areas of his life. But then there's the rest of us. All of us have problems controlling our impulses. We don't have to have serious injuries or occupy positions of authority to know that. Recent studies have estimated that about half the time that we try to control our impulses, we fail at it. And so what we're going to understand now is that we fail to control our impulses, and by having these problems, it's a beginning. It's a first step in trying to understand how self-control works so we can develop effective, scientifically based solutions to improve our self-control. Now, in the scientific literature, there are lots of different definitions of self-control floating around. In this course, we'll use a specific definition of self-control. And that definition is that self-control refers to overriding an impulse so that you can agree with a standard for what's appropriate. Now, when people have to control their impulses, usually three different things happen. The first thing that happens is that people feel an urge to do something, or to think about something, or to feel something. Next, what happens is people feel a desire or a motivation to override that urge, to override that impulse. And the third part of the self-control chain of events is by overriding that impulse, you've adhered to a standard, an objective reference point for what's appropriate. So let's see how this three-step process plays out in everyday life. What I'd like for you to do is to imagine a situation where you sit down at a table and you're presented with a very tempting food. A food that you like, but you also know that you shouldn't eat very often. Let's think of a donut. Now, most people like donuts, and they know that they shouldn't eat lots of them. What happens when people see donuts is they engage in self-control. So they experience a strong urge to eat 1, 2, or maybe even half a dozen donuts, and they override that urge. They go to battle with themselves a little bit. And by doing that, they remain in agreement. They adhere to a standard about the appropriate amount to eat in a given situation. So that's one example of the self-control chain of events playing out in our everyday lives. But then there are also areas of our life where we can apply the same sort of principles. Think about people who might have problems with gambling. When they're driving down the street and they see a casino, immediately they might get a strong urge to gamble. Next, this urge will be overridden. They'll go to battle with themselves. They'll tell themselves, whatever you do, do not drive into that parking lot. Don't go into the casino. Don't gamble. And the reason why they do that is so that they can remain in agreement with the standards set before themselves about what their goal is. What's the most desirable behavior in this circumstance? If I don't want to overeat, if I don't want to gamble, if I don't want to engage in other sorts of behaviors that I know are going to be damaging to my physical health, my mental health, my relationships, or other aspects of my life, I can override my impulse so that I can achieve those goals. And by doing that, I can live my life in a way that's more satisfying and fulfilling. So this is what self-control is, and this is just a snapshot of how it unfolds in everyday life. Now that we have a working definition of self-control, let's break it into its three main compartments. Now, the first part of self-control is called monitoring. And this simply refers to keeping track of what you think, what you feel, and how you're behaving. The more that people monitor themselves in these ways, oftentimes the better able they are to achieve their goals. One example of how monitoring plays out in people's lives is with their weight. Numerous studies have shown that the more that people monitor their weight, the healthier weight that they have. People who check their weight every day tend to have healthier weight levels than people who check their weight less frequently, maybe once a month, once every 3 months, or once a year. Our money is another area of our life where monitoring can play a vital role in helping us achieve our goals. It's never been easier to keep track of how much money you have coming in and how much money you have going out of your checking account and your saving account. Banks these days are making it extremely easy to do this, whether by logging on to a computer online or even by downloading an app on your phone. The good thing about this is that by keeping track of how much money you have, studies have shown that people are a lot more responsible with how they manage their money. So monitoring is the first compartment, the first part of what self-control is. The second part is what we refer to as standards. Standards are those reference points. They're personal, cultural, or societal standards that tell us what's appropriate in a given situation. Now, what are some examples of standards in our everyday life? Well, one of them is simply the laws that we have to obey as members of a particular society. Think of speed limits. A speed limit sign is a clear, objective indicator about a standard for what is appropriate in a given situation. Now, although many of us don't like to follow the speed limit, it at least shows us what a standard is and how important it is to follow it. Another example of standards is how we dress, what we wear. There are clear and sometimes even explicit directions about what you should wear and what you should not wear in certain circumstances. These are standards. When you make a decision about what to wear when you go to work, to a party, to a barbecue, or some other fun activity, what you're thinking about are standards. What's guiding me along the path of what's most appropriate in this circumstance? Now, monitoring and standards, those are the first two components of self-control, and the third is strength. This is simply the amount of energy that you have to control your impulses. Factors that can undermine your energy are mental exhaustion and stress. When people are fatigued, like at the end of the day, maybe after working 3 consecutive shifts, they might experience self-control failure. They might do things they normally wouldn't. And a reason for that is they simply have used up their limited supply of self-control energy. Now, the good thing about self-control energy is that you can build it up through practice. Just as you can strengthen your physical muscles through practice, you can strengthen your self-control muscles. In one of my favorite examples of this, Joshua Foer, who is a science writer, set forth on an adventure that lasted 1 year. Now, in this adventure, what Joshua Foer set out to do was to win the USA Memory Championship. Now, how do you do this? Well, what Joshua Foer did was he spent an entire year practicing self-control in a very specific way regarding his memory performance. Now, although initially this was painful, it took a lot of energy to do this, what he found was that over time he built up his self-control strength. And at the end of a year, he won the USA Memory Championships. So self-control is important, and it's important for us to understand how it's divided into 3 main components: monitoring, standards, and strength. And although we have limited self-control strength, we can build it up and achieve our goals over time. If you could draw a picture of self-control, what would it look like? You might think of people exercising, eating healthy foods, working hard, paying attention. But if you ask me, I would draw a picture of a thermostat, because that's one way that self-control functions. Now think of how thermostats work. What do they do? What alerts them to when they get turned on? Well, one thing that we have to think about when we think of thermostats is that there's a clear standard for what's appropriate. There's a certain temperature that you want to have. And when things get hotter or colder, the thermostat kicks on and it adjusts things in the environment so that you can remain in adherence with that standard for the appropriate temperature. Now, your body functions in a very similar way. You have a set core body temperature of 98.6 degrees. This is stable, and this alerts you to a very healthy level of a body temperature. But what happens when your temperature goes up or when it goes down? When you get a fever, or when you may even experience hypothermia? Well, as no surprise, you feel sick. You don't feel like yourself. And you do things to restore yourself to a sense of balance so that you return to the standard for what's appropriate. Now, self-control works in a very similar fashion. We're constantly seeking balance. And one way that we do that is we're steered or navigated toward what those standards are for what's appropriate. Now, this line of reasoning forms the backbone of what's called cybernetic theory. Now, cybernetic derives from the Greek word to steer or to navigate. And what we're talking about, what is going to help us have better self-control, it's these very standards that steer us and navigate us toward the appropriate thought, feeling, and behavior. Now, using this theory, we can walk ourselves through what it's like to exert self-control. Think of an example of a situation where there are clear-cut standards for how you should act, what you should think, or even what you should feel. Think of a funeral. Now, you walk into the funeral and you begin to establish a baseline about what people are doing. This is the test phase. Next, what you do is you begin to do things. You're in the operate phase. Now, although you know what other people are doing, suddenly a thought comes into your head, a funny thought, and you begin to laugh uncontrollably. You look to your right and you look to your left and you see other people looking at you with very disapproving glances. This is the test phase again. You're receiving feedback from your environment that says you've gone off track. You're no longer engaging in appropriate action, and you need to correct that right away. The next phase is the exit phase. This is where people continue to test themselves. And it feeds back into this first phase where people test themselves again. They operate again. They test again, getting additional feedback. And they go through this process as long as is necessary in order for them to stop at this standard for what is deemed appropriate. So test, operate, test, exit. This forms the backbone of cybernetic theory. And this helps us explain why we constantly seek out balance in our life. Because by doing that, we're going to be doing what's appropriate. Now, people can do these sorts of things in different ways. They can pursue their goals using different strategies. One type of strategy is called a promotion focus. People who are promotion focused are extremely eager to achieve success. They're constantly entering their environments knowing that they can do well and trying to achieve all that they possibly can. Another strategy is slightly different. It's called a prevention-focused strategy. Instead of being extremely eager, prevention-focused people are vigilant. They're constantly looking for signs of where they might want to avoid making mistakes. So you can pursue self-control in lots of different ways using these two different strategies. But the important thing to remember is how we're naturally programmed to want to have balance. Because by having balance, we're going to be able to get along with other people a lot easier because we'll be doing what's appropriate. Now that we understand what self-control is and a little bit about how it works, let's talk about a practical way that we can improve our self-control in a way that's not going to take a whole lot of work. Now, how are we going to do this? Well, one way that we can improve our self-control is by forming what are called implementation intentions. What an implementation intention does is it essentially takes your mind out of the middle of the equation between your desire and what you actually do. Where do we get tripped up when we're trying to control our impulses? We all know what we want to do in most situations, yet we often have problems meeting our goals. One reason for this is we go to battle with ourselves. We fight with ourselves. We debate with ourselves about if this is the appropriate thing to do and why. By forming an implementation intention, it gets rid of that mental argument. And research has shown over dozens and dozens of studies that this is a safe and effective way of improving people's self-control, of helping them to achieve their goals. So how do you form one of these? How do you form an implementation intention? All that you do is you form an if-then agreement. Think of it as a mental contract you're setting up for yourself. Now let's apply this to physical activity. Let's say that you have a goal of becoming more active in your life. If you want to improve your physical activity, one thing that you can do is set up an implementation intention that says, if I get home from work, then I'll get my exercise clothes and exercise for 10 minutes. What you've done is you've set a clear and specific plan for how you're going to achieve your goal. So now, when you get home and you have this lingering idea as to whether or not you should work out, the mental work has already been done for you, by you. You've already set up a contract that you've agreed to that says, I'm home now, the first part of this agreement is done. Now I know what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to get my clothes and I'm supposed to work out for just 10 minutes. Now let's think of this in the choices that we make with our money. A lot of times when people are spending money that they might not have, or when people are failing to control their impulses when it comes to their money, they're doing so when they're mentally fatigued or under duress. They're depleted of their self-control energy. So if you're having problems in your life that are related to this, simply set up an implementation intention for yourself. And that implementation intention could be as simple as, if I want to charge something on my credit card after 10 p.m., then I'll wait to buy that thing until the next morning. So what this does is it frees you up. You're not doing battle against yourself as to whether or not, do I really need this? Do I not need this? You're not going to buy it tonight because you've already decided for yourself that that's not the best thing for you to do right now. Now, it sounds almost too good to be true that simply by setting up these if-then contingency statements in your life, that it's going to help you achieve your goals. But there's a lot of scientific evidence that backs this up, whether it's related to your work, to your physical health, to other types of self-control or goal-related problems that you're facing. By setting up these implementation intentions, you're getting your mind out of the middle. And in this case, that's a good thing in terms of enabling you to achieve your goals. And so by understanding what self-control is and how it works, we can better achieve our goals. And we have a clear-cut strategy for effective tools we can bring into our lives that can help us struggle less, to live a little bit easier, and to achieve things that we didn't think were even possible.